Testing test. Yeah, so this one I'm doing right now.
That light is so bright. All right, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming to our event. I'm Simeon Mann. I'm a faculty member in the history department, and I'm also the associate director for the Institute of Arts and Humanities. And we're really pleased that you've joined us for this conversation. So before I get started, just want to very quickly thank our co-sponsors for making this event happen. So I want to thank Departments of History, Ethnic Studies, Institute of Arts and Humanities, and university centers for providing the funds and support to make this event happen. I also want to give a special shout out to Albert Akbayani for being a co-organizer and to his team for helping out with everything. So the theme of our conversation today is food, race, politics. Does that cover it? Right, okay, so we don't actually have a title for the event, but those are the themes that we're gonna be talking about. Right, so things that we often don't talk about together, right? Race and politics, but if there's one takeaway from our conversation today is that, right, you actually can't disentangle these things. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. So Soleil Ho is the San Francisco Chronicle's restaurant critic. She's written for a bunch of food and pop culture publications like Bitch, Food and Wine, Taste, and Wine Enthusiast, and hosted podcasts like Propaganda and Racist Sandwich. Mark Padungpats is an associate professor of Asian American Studies and Interdisciplinary Studies in the Department of Interdisciplinary, Gender, and Ethnic Studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He is the author of Flavors of Empire, Food and the Making of Thai America. So Mark's books are actually available for purchase in the back. Those of you who are going to be taking HILT 7B next quarter, you can get a head start and purchase that book because that is one of the assigned readings. Yeah, and he's gonna be signing books, so. All right, with that, should we go ahead and get started? Please help me welcome our guests.
All hear me? Okay, great. Thank you all for coming and spending this evening with us. I feel like we were joking, we should do some kind of slam poetry duo thing right now because it feels that way. And I also want to thank everybody who was involved for making this happen and for bringing us out, and to thank Soleil as well. We actually have never met in person, but we've kind of read each other's stuff. And so I'm really excited to be in conversation with you on the stage with everybody else too. And so I guess just to kind of get us started, I just wanted to give you a little background about my work. And so I wrote a book called Flavors of Empire, Food and the Making of Thai America. And the book explores the history of how and why Thai food came to the United States, specifically LA. And I argue in the book that Thai food becomes central to Thai American community and identity formation in the United States, and beyond just a cultural identity. So it's more than just heritage, right? That food becomes the main way that American society comes to understand Thai people. And by default, that's how Thai people in the United States come to understand themselves in relationship to how the US understands them. And so that's kind of what I tease out in the book. And in terms of like what you could expect in that story is that I don't start when Thai people get to LA in the 1970s. I start when the United States goes to Thailand during the Cold War. So in the 1950s and 60s, that's where the story begins. So the first chapter covers the U.S. expansion in Thailand and how like Peace Corps activists were some of the first people to quote unquote discover Thai cuisine, and then brought it back to LA before Thai people even got to LA. So the first Thai cookbook, for example, is called Siamese Cookery, and it was published in 1965, before there were any significant number of Thai people in LA. And so I start there. Then I talk about the migration of Thai people to LA, the opening of a grocery store, the Bangkok Market. Does anybody know Jet Tila? He's kind of a celebrity chef now, Thai celebrity chef. He's always on the Food Network, but his family opens the first Thai restaurant in LA in 1971. And so that becomes like another turning point in the story. And then the growth and explosion of Thai food culture in the 1980s across Los Angeles. And so those are the kind of key turning points of the book. And I think what I wanted to accomplish, I wanted to do a lot of things writing this book. But one is I wanted to show, and this is partly the conversation that I think Soleil and I are going to have tonight, is the dynamism of food as a way to study history and to tell stories, right? That if we go beyond just cooking and eating, we can talk about and use food to analyze and make sense of the world around us in all these different ways. Not just what we eat or what we consume, but where and how we get ingredients, import-export policies. And so food can allow us to tell really complicated and complex stories of various communities. And so I wanted to show that by writing the book. And the other thing I wanted to kind of tease out was how this, what I term a cuisine-driven multiculturalism, right? Like this idea that, eating the cuisine of another group somehow is going to alleviate racism or in the United States, or like relieve that tension between groups, right? So I tried to write a book that showed how that idea and that practice came to be, and how it's a very limited, hands-off kind of approach to racial inequality in the United States. And so I think those were two of the things that I wanted the book to do. And if you have questions as we open it up for Q&A, I can answer any questions that you all have too.
Cool. Hi, hello. Can everyone hear me in this microphone? Maybe, yes. We'll just trust the process. So you're saying that because I like my pad thai extra spicy, that means I don't understand Thai people completely? What? Okay, well, I guess now I'll talk about my work. I'm really excited to be here with Mark and all of you. I have voraciously read Mark's book, Flavors of Empire. I think it's one of the first texts, like academic-ish texts that I've read that actually take food seriously as something that we can actually think about in an analytical way, in a culturally significant way, in a way that actually tells stories about migration and people and ideology. So please buy it. I highly recommend it. So yeah, my name is Soleil Ho. I have recently become the food critic at the San Francisco Chronicle, which is the paper of record in the Bay Area, up there. And I have always read food writing. Even when I was a kid, I would read restaurant critics. I grew up in New York City, so I would read New York Magazine, the New York Times, and just like read about restaurants. I didn't care about all the other shit, but it was just like, what were the new places that were opening up in my neighborhood? You know, that was really exciting to me. I loved knowing about food. And for me, especially as a daughter of like a refugee family, that is how we understood the world. One of the first things that I remember seeing in my family's photo album is a picture of my grandfather in the basement of a church with like a huge bucket of fried chicken. And I think that's how they got him, is just through the fried chicken. That's how he, like, in their small town of Illinois where they were placed after they escaped from Vietnam in 1975, fried chicken was like what anchored them in their community. Because they didn't have to like ask questions. They didn't have to know what it was. It was just delicious. And so from there, I went to school and I got really into the idea of film analysis and and basically the principle that you can look at a single frame of a film, and have it tell you so many stories about what the director's trying to tell you, what the actors are trying to tell you, what society's trying to tell you. And it became really clear that you could apply that to food and restaurants as well. And that idea really excited me because for so long, food media was extremely white, and it continues to be extremely white. Whiteness is centered as the default. Everything that is not from Europe or the United States, like Anglo society, has to be explained, for instance, with the explanatory comma, and I found that really interesting once I started to see it. You know, for instance, you would think you wouldn't have to explain what sriracha is, but people still do that to this day in like major magazines and publications, which I think is absurd. And so, you know, I realized I was reading all this stuff, the stuff that I really cared about as a kid, in the end also made me feel like an alien in my own country. And so I thought, okay, if I apply the principles of film analysis, of post-structuralism, which I'm a big fan of, and I'll try not to bore you with any of the words that I learned through all that, basically the principle that everything around us tells the story. Everything is a deliberate choice, whether you think so or not, that taps into ideology, and it taps into what we believe, what we think other people believe, and you know, just what other people are making us believe. So for restaurants and food, people don't think they're political. People don't think that those things are things you should talk about in the same breath as you talk about race or class or patriarchy, gender politics, sexuality. But I think more and more people are starting to understand that no, like all of these things do belong together, because food, like film, like anything that is a creative endeavor that comes from people's minds, is affected by ideology and discourse and all of the political beliefs that we carry. So why don't we just expose that and talk about it? So I try to weave in a lot of that stuff in my writing. And historically, that's been my beat, my niche that I became known for in the past, 5 years. Because nobody was doing it. Nobody was very interested in that in the popular sphere. In academia, surely there are people like Mark who are like really trying to make this stuff relevant. And I know that I'm sure you get pushback sometimes from administrator types who don't understand why like food matters. But it does, and students love hearing about food too. But what I was trying to do was force a vocabulary so that everyone who was like me, like the kids who were reading restaurant criticism and food writing, could see a little bit of their thought processes reflected in the writing, so they could feel validated. Because if you read a story in the New York Times business section about like bubble tea that treats it like some alien like slop, you're gonna feel like an alien, right? You're gonna feel minimized, invalidated, because that is such a normal part of your daily life. But so why are they treating it like some weird thing? So that's generally the gist of what informs my work. I review restaurants once a week, and it's exactly what you think it is. I get paid to eat and then write about whether or not I liked it. It's great. It's like Yelp Reloaded. It's the best. But what I try to do is talk about colonialism and talk about gender dynamics and talk about just how, especially in a city like San Francisco, which is so informed by wealth disparity, and it really, you can't notice, right? Make it so that people will still be thinking about all of that stuff that impacts us every day, even when they read about nice restaurants, because it is relevant. The last thing I ever want is to give people an escape hatch. I am very anti-escapism when it comes to food. I want the phantoms of, inequity and, just basically living in a modern day apartheid state to haunt the food section as well, because I think that is, if you ignore it and you pretend it's not there, then what is the use of being in the news? I think that is integral to my philosophy here. Yeah, that's me.
Want to kind of give the opportunity for Mark and Soleil to speak to each other and to respond to each other's comments, and also to open it up for a Q&A. But I thought maybe to get started, I would just throw out a broad question, building off of what you both said, and that is just a simple question of why food? Why did food become the vehicle or the point of emphasis for talking about these things like race, immigration, politics, right?
So for me, food is the easiest possible metaphor for so many of these big things. So a little bit of background. When I graduated from college, I started working in restaurants as a cook. That was my main gig, and I would write on the side. And I found myself working alongside a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different education levels, but still a lot of really interesting thoughts and things to say about society and the way the world worked around us. And of course, I was also, my brain was so addled from being in school, I didn't know how to talk to human beings. And so what I would do was just, the most present metaphors were the things in front of us, which were food, like food items. And the easiest way for me to start the conversation was, where did this come from? Why are we making kimchi in this French restaurant? And then you start, I think the answers blossom out, and then you start to think about these transnational ideas and are able to articulate them because it's right there.
So as a Thai American, so I was born and raised in Hollywood. I actually grew up in Pacoima, California. So I was born and raised in Hollywood, grew up in Pacoima, a predominantly Latino working class suburb. And food was such an important part of my life growing up. Obviously, as a Thai American, as a Thai immigrant, I went to the Thai temple. Thai temple always had food festivals. And so for that reason, I actually did not ever want to write about Thai food. So that book, the book that I wrote, I did not want to write about food at all. I went to undergrad at the University of Oregon, and then I went to USC for my PhD, and I was adamant about writing the very first history of Thai Americans in the United States. So there wasn't anything on Thai Americans, there wasn't anything on Thai American experiences, and so for me, my goal was I'm just gonna write that history outside of food, because everybody knows everything about Thai food, and I wanna tell the other side of the story. And so that was my goal, and I was very deliberate about not wanting to write about food. It just felt cliche too. I was like, I'm Thai American, I'm gonna write about food as one of the first Thai American scholars. And so in graduate school, the other thing is I also felt and I don't know if this resonates with some of you all, but I also felt like food was like a distraction. That there were all of these real issues, and this is me kind of as an undergrad, right? I was like, there's all these real issues we're dealing with, right? Housing discrimination and access to healthcare, immigration issues, labor exploitation. Why the hell do we keep having food festivals? That's not gonna address any of these issues. And then the more I kind of researched, and the more I started, when I started writing my dissertation, that's when it started all coming together, and I realized that food was connected to all of these things that I wanted to talk about. It was connected to the labor exploitation. It was connected to Thai town and inadequate housing. It was connected to health issues because people weren't getting healthcare working in Thai restaurants. It was connected to undocumented Thai migration to the United States because people were working in restaurants who were undocumented. And so all of these issues I started to see being connected to food. So instead of like avoiding it and just saying, you know what, like I'm gonna tell the real history, I was like, why don't I just flip it and just flip it on people and say, okay, you think, we know a lot about Thai food, but how about I use that as an entryway to talk about all the issues that I wish that you would know when you say that you like Thai food or when you say that you love Thai food. Here are the things that I would hope that you would know. And so that's how I kind of became interested in food. So it wasn't, because a lot of people, I say a lot of people, but I mean, I think there's some people who view my work and as an academic, and Soleil's absolutely right. In history, not so much in Asian American studies, but definitely in history, there's a perception that like what I do is not legitimate scholarship. Because people don't write about food, right? Food is pleasurable, food is fun. It's not a serious topic like war or racial segregation in housing. But for me, all of these things are connected. It manifests in the everyday, just like through food culture. And so, I would hope that, that's kind of how I came to food, and I would hope that we can all kind of learn to see food in its complexity in that way. But that's how I came to food, and that's why I started kind of focusing on food to really address these themes of race, immigration, the migrant experience.
So I'm curious then about because what you're saying about pleasure is really interesting. Why do you think that food in particular is so hard to get people to take seriously? Is it because it's so rooted in the intimacy of enjoying yourself?
Yeah, I think it's that, and I think they conflate the intimacy and the pleasure with it being too subjective, right? Because it hits at an emotional core. So like the food we eat, we have deep connections to it. And I think scholars, because they're so invested in this idea of objectivity, that you can't possibly like what you're writing about, right? Like you can't possibly have that strong of a feeling and connection towards food and then write about it objectively. I think that's one element of it. The other is that I think it's also gendered, because a lot of the food writing that was coming out, and then we talked about this at lunch too. A lot of the food writing that came out 70s and 80s, and really the history of food writing is seen as it's not legitimate work. It's not real news, right? That it's just fluff. And so I think that's also an element of it, that if you're relying on food critics, if you're focusing on food, you're kind of doing food writing. Food writing is not legitimate. It never has been. It's not a serious endeavor. And it's what women do, right? So women are the ones that are like writing about food. And so I think all of these things, influence how people see food scholarship and food history.
And actually, you pull on a lot of that food writing too in your text. I think it was you pulled on like Ruth Reichel, Jonathan Gold, and a lot of these early Thai cookbook writers who were white women who lived in LA, I think. And you never really see those people quoted in academic books. I thought that was so fascinating. Was that an easy jump for you? Did you have to justify that at all?
I mean, I didn't have to justify it, because I felt like I had. So one of the things that I was confident in was that I'd done enough reading and I was engaged with the academic literature that I could make sense of those things in an academic way. And for me, it was just more about, I think showing that we can actually study these issues through food, but also that like I was trained as the kind of historian that cared about the issue and that cared about the larger question and how that could help make the world, like how we can use that to impact society, right? And there are a lot of historians who just care about the craft, right? That like, I want to find out and I want to investigate when this copper penny was made. And then they find that out and they're like, I can assure you was made in 1910. Like, so where are we now, right? Like, you gave us the answer, 1910, thank you. But for me, it's always been about how is this history going to help us in our day-to-day? And because of that, it like, yes, I believe in method, I believe in rigor, I believe you have to have some kind of approach, but at the end of the day, why are we not opening our investigation to every possible approach we can imagine as historians, as people who study history, as academics, right? If I'm interested in that history, I'm gonna use every possible angle and tool and anything that I have to uncover that. And if it falls outside of that, if food falls outside of that, then so be it. But that, to me, is a way for me to get to these larger questions.
What's funny is I think that we both, like, we each are the opposite of each other in our approaches. Because I am also supposed to be in this field where you just talk about what's on the plate. You say in your review, like, I went to X restaurant and I had the steak, it was too salty. I had this like Bordeaux from such and such place. It was great with the steak. The server was a little bit of an asshole. The end, 3 stars. You know, like that is without context, without history. And so I'm doing the inverse, where I'm pulling in what you're doing as a historian into the work that I'm doing to better inform the public about the context of why this restaurant matters, where it is in society. And I think that makes things much more rich, much more interesting, and more rigorous, actually.
I think that's, something that I'm just fascinated by and really admire you for, is your ability to take the conversations that we're having as academics into this field, into the quote-unquote real world. And I think it's important because it's a lot of what we think about as professors, but also what students are thinking about in terms of like, what the hell am I going to do with an ethnic studies degree?
Right, like what does this have to do with my life?
What the hell am I going to do with an Asian American studies degree? And I think you're a model of what you can do with this kind of analysis. And so, I wanted to know more about, when did this happen for you? Like, when did you start reading the stuff in ethnic studies, Asian American studies, and then kind of applying it to your work?
So I had the misfortune of not being in the right place at the right time for any ethnic studies curriculum at all. I have never taken a single ethnic studies course or Asian American studies course because I went to a very small liberal arts college that was just kind of by the book. So all of the reading and education that I received in that was after school. I would read books as they were coming out and like articles. I was so fascinated by this burgeoning field. And so it was a lot of self-study. I think where it clicked was when I went to my MFA program, actually. So I tried to get an MFA in creative nonfiction writing. It's a long story. I ended up explaining race and gender and class to my cohort during our workshops when I was the one who was supposed to be the student. And I realized I was wasting my time, so I dropped out. So there's a dropout on stage. And I realized that, okay, I need to just like, if I'm gonna be working to articulate this stuff, I better be getting paid to do this. But I guess where it clicked for me was, one, that food wasn't being taken seriously. So I saw that there was an opportunity here to actually educate the public, talk about this stuff that I had learned about and was so enthusiastic about. And like I said, food is such an easy metaphor. Everyone probably eats food. Everyone has some idea, like food media and food writing is so popular now, and food TV is so popular. I think most people in this room have seen an episode of a food show or like looked at food writing or read at least one restaurant review. I'm sure all of you look at Yelp, right? And so the ways in which people talk about food can't help but like be informed by society and by ideology. And so nobody was picking that stuff apart in the way that I wanted to. And so that's where it came from. Because no one was doing it, I decided to do it.
And why? So this is a question I get a lot, right? So why would you want to critique what is so good about sharing cultures and trying different foods and learning about each other through food? Isn't this a wonderful glorious
This
thing.
is-
Like, this is where we should be going as a society, right? Like, we should be trying each other's foods. It opens up conversations. It's a gateway to culture. So why would we want to kind of think about race? Like, why go there with this?
This is the cultural appropriation question. I also get this question all the time. I often do interviews where like a white host or somebody will be like, "So I made curry for dinner on Tuesday night. Does that mean I'm a bad person?" I don't know how to answer that. I never.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, go to hell. No, of course not. You're fine. I'm not like the food pope. I'm not gonna send you to jail. So yeah, I think that's, to me, that's the interesting part, right? Where we can talk about these bigger ethical questions with food and choice, and we can talk about capitalism, and we can talk about racial hierarchy when we ask that basic question about like who owns this dish. You know, I don't. Cultural appropriation is real. It is a thing that happens. I don't think it's necessarily bad, but it's a great entree into thinking about how society is arranged, how the racial wealth gap operates and persists. Because in a vacuum, it's fine, right? We share things. When your friends want to cook you dinner, like you're going to eat it and you're going to be nice about it because they love you and you love them. But when we think on the macro scale of like seeing patterns in who owns what restaurants and who's profiting off of whose food or their culture or whatever, and who's being demeaned for that same act of making that food, then we see these bigger things. And yeah, I guess the why of it is like, I am a party pooper. I love problematizing. I love making people very uncomfortable and unhappy. So that's my answer.
Okay, so to build on that, I mean, I think, so I guess I think about it in two ways, and I try to explore this a little bit in the book. And I'll let you all decide, right? So there's two camps, I guess, of thinking around this. One is what I just presented, and I think what we face. So there are scholars and there are people in general who view this eating the cuisine of the other, right? Eating someone else's cuisine as generally a positive thing because it at least allows us to imagine those people as part of our society in a positive way, right? So that can't be a negative thing. It's and especially in comparison to like xenophobia and anti-Asian sentiment and all these other like more kind of explicitly racist things. Like why is eating someone else's food like compared to that? There's no way this is the same. But then there's another camp that has argued that this is what happens, and this is what has happened in colonial history. So colonists, European colonists going to Africa, they collected elephant tusks. Did that mean that they appreciated African culture? It was more of an expression of their class status and racial status to be collecting these items, right? And so there's a whole other school of thought that sees the eating and the trying of food as actually an act of domination. That this is how you know your group has been subsumed in larger society, that these foods are available and that you can try them and you can have these adventures by eating these other foods. And so there's these two different schools of thought around this. And so I think that I'll let you all decide kind of where you fall, but I think that those are the two main ways to think about what eating the food of the other means and the racial politics, I think, of that.
Right, but there are also nuances between the schools, right? There's a third place that you could fall, many third places, actually. And what I find interesting is the ways in which generally our stances can shift over time as well, depending on the context, and also depending on the economic success of a certain like minority group as well, because at some point they're able to determine the direction of where their cuisine or their culture is going in the majority culture. I see it with Thai food, for instance, right? And even in the evolution of Chinese American cuisine, I feel like maybe just a few decades ago, and I mean now too, it lingers, but there was a lot of tension and debate over Americanized Chinese food, right? I'm sure a lot of you have heard people denigrate it or like just put it down as something that's like inauthentic or gross or just, fake. But I think many people are beginning to realize also, it's because of the ways in which society is arranged. People had to make economic choices. When they are the one Chinese family in a small town, are you going to make like Sichuanese food? Or are you going to make the basic Cantonese, Panda Express menu that everyone else is making, and that's what the people want? So you can send your kids to schools like this, so they don't have to work in a restaurant. There's nuances to it that I think complicate that narrative in ways that I find really interesting. And now we're at the point where the children of those people are opening their own restaurants and determining, they're hashing out their own feelings towards their parents' cuisine and the cuisine they grew up with in America as well. So you have a distinct like Asian American type of restaurant these days, like Mission Chinese food, or gosh, there's so many kinds of restaurants that do this kind of work, where they're integrating the pantries that they grew up with, which had soy sauce and Wonder Bread and Spam and all of these things together, and that makes up a palette. Doesn't make it less authentic, whatever that means, right? But it makes it its own distinct cuisine, and I find that really fascinating. And I'm sure there's a lot of, because you talk a lot about like the evolution of Thai cuisine and how it became Americanized as well. And I'd like to hear more about that stigma.
Yeah, I think I visited a class, Simeon's class earlier today, and we kind of started talking about, what is authentic Thai food, or how do we determine this, right? And I think, I've always answered that question by saying it's not really generative and productive to really ask what is authentic, because then you start to try to measure this. The question really is who gets to define what is authentic and why are they doing it, right? And so the Thai government has its idea of what is authentic Thai food, and the reason they're doing it is because it's going to help them with their economic development plan, right? So as they promote tourism, they want to have a very standardized idea of what Thai food is. But for Thai people in the United States, it could be a lot of different things, right? It could be using Mexican corn husks to make Thai desserts, right? And that's just as authentic because it's based in LA. It came out of LA, and it came out of a Thai American restaurant or a Thai restaurant. And so I think it's always important to ask those questions. I kind of just don't, you can see I'm skirting around it. So anybody asks me is this authentic? I'm like, I don't know, what do you mean? How do you define authentic? Yeah, sure, I guess it is. Someone made it, someone's grandma made it. So yeah, I think it's authentic.
Yeah, my grandmother put Sprite in her nukjam, her fish sauce, because that's just it's the easiest way to make it sweet and limey. And she's the most Vietnamese person I know. So why would I give her crap over that,
Yeah, it's funny because I was so there's a new show I didn't even think I was going to talk about this, but there's a new show coming out in April by Padma Lakshmi. So she just announced a show. So Padma of Top Chef fame is coming out with a new show. And she did an episode on Thai food in Las Vegas, which is where I'm at now. And so I'm in the episode, and as we're filming this episode, we're in a Thai grocery store, and she sees this Thai coconut cutter thing. I don't know if you all have seen it. It looks like a wooden thing with a little saw at the end, and she's like, "Oh, that's Mark. You know what this is?" And I was like, "Padma, if you think that I was in the backyard carving up coconuts on this thing, you're crazy." Because we just use canned coconut, right? Canned coconut milk. I wasn't in the backyard topless, carving up these coconuts to make authentic coconut cream. But I think that's what I'm saying, right? It's when we talk about authenticity, it's we, the food I grew up with, my mom bought stuff in cans. She used chicken bouillon cubes, right? So it wasn't she wasn't boiling down a chicken to get the perfect broth. Like they did back in the day or whenever.
That's what I find fascinating about the act of food criticism, actually, is that a lot of times I'll be asked if a restaurant is authentic. And, the old way of doing it, and I think some people still do this, is they do measure a restaurant or they criticize it based on where it falls on the authenticity scale. Is this authentic Burmese cuisine? Is this authentic Ethiopian? Or is it, Americanized? There's an interesting spectrum that's imposed on there. And I, like Mark, I'm a dirty cultural relativist, and I prefer not to answer that question because I think it's bullshit. What I think, because we don't hold cuisine from communities that are not of color to that same standard, and often we will be more willing to pan, cuisines from communities of color for their lack of authenticity or for their authenticity. You know, it's like too spicy, or it's too strange, or it's too sweet, or too American. You can't really win. And it also leads to these really interesting, awful issues in the restaurant world where, like, a Chinese restaurant, for instance, can't charge more than X amount for its food. Otherwise, it's inauthentic. Or, you know, it's price gouging, or, you know, it's not appropriate for the cuisine. I'm sure many of us would have relatives, too, who would hold that food to that same standard, right? And would probably balk at paying, like, $8 for a banh mi, right? But that also holds those restaurateurs back from paying better wages, actually providing health care for their employees, buying better ingredients, and actually participating in the organic food movement. They get stuck. And so authenticity is often a trap. You know, it's often used as a way to keep people in their place and keep them from actually advancing and gaining a foothold in an industry that's already so hard. And so I usually try to stay away from that. And the other question, too, that I find really difficult, but also inspiring, is the idea that as a critic, I should know what great Burmese food is, what great Kenyan food is, what great Indonesian food is. And all of those are really disparate, right? They're all really different. I'm not an expert on everything. And it also speaks to how the definition of a restaurant has expanded. Previously, people wouldn't really go to these other restaurants, or they would apply their own, like, exoticized, like, ideas on, like, how this restaurant should be, right? How a Thai restaurant should be from an outsider perspective. And so trying to come up with a way to be honest with where I'm coming from, but also do the due diligence to honor the restaurant for what it's trying to be rather than what I want it to be based on my own preconceptions is a challenge. And so usually what I do is I ask people who are of that culture to tell me.
So what has been the reception to your work? I imagine people, not everybody is taking this and saying, this is amazing, like you're exposing issues of inequality and racism and colonialism for me. What has been the overall reception towards your view and your lens on restaurants?
It's actually pretty generationally and, like, racially divided, as one would think. So I certainly have, you know, negative responses from people who just want a glorified Yelp review. They just want to know about what's on the plate. They don't care about colonialism. They don't care about history. They don't care about any of this other crap. They just want to know if the steak was good. Fine. I can't help them. Because that's not what I'm doing. I will tell them if the steak is good, but I'm going to tell them the history of that steak as well, and they're going to have to read that. So the interesting part for me is that a lot of younger people, and younger people of color especially, who have not felt seen in this particular genre have reached out to me, and, like, they're really happy about what I'm doing. They're excited. The fact that I'm applying, like, a semi-academic, like, understanding of society to something that was such a maligned genre, such a not a very smart genre in general, is exciting to them. And so that's kind of where I take my strength. But, you know, I think that if I make this field a little bit more amenable to whoever comes after me, I think I'll be happy. Because right now we're in this interesting transition period where I replaced at the Chronicle a gentleman who had been in my job for 32 years, and that's longer than I've been alive. And so that's a huge transition. I'm very different from him, and so it's really uncomfortable for a lot of people, me included.
I mean, I'm thinking about this, and I've been thinking about the question that you raised a little bit ago too, just about, and I guess more broadly for all of us to think about this relationship between race and politics, right? So why cultural appropriation, but more broadly, just why do we want to talk about food and race, right? Why do we want to talk about this? And I think one of the things that I've said at some point in time in the last 2 years is, generally speaking, I think most people are going to be open to trying other foodways, and most people will like or want to enjoy or have some experience eating new cuisine. But the problem with that, and I think the issue with that, is like this fascination. We can see it as a positive thing, right? Of wanting to learn. But it does two things for me. One is that, and this is what I write in the book too, is that when the fascination with Thai cuisine happened, the way that people explained why there were so many Thai restaurants in the United States compared to how many Thai people there were was that it was some kind of like cultural thing within the Thai people and like some natural ability within Thai people that, because they love cooking so much and their food culture is so great, that's why the restaurants are opening. And for me, it was incredibly problematic because that justified why Thai people were working in the service industry, right? So instead of paying attention to issues of like immigration or the economy, the racialization and gender dynamics of the service industry, like all of these larger issues of why people are doing the jobs that they do and why people end up in the jobs they do, instead of paying attention to that, people were like, Thai people love Thai food. Like, it's a natural thing. And so it just justifies your position in society, right? And I think about, there was a moment a couple years ago where I believe there was a Trump supporter who, the way that they were framed were like they were anti-immigrant, right? And so he was, I think, protesting or something on the street, and a Latino guy walks by, and he's just like, with the Mexican flag, kind of taunting him. And then the dude tells the Latino guy, he's like, "Go cook my fucking burrito. Go cook my fucking burrito, bitch." And then in that moment, right, I'm like, that's it, right? It's not that they don't like our food. It's that as long as we are cooking the food and as long as we are in a service-based position, it's fine. It's the minute we start to want to participate in politics, it's the minute we have a political idea, it's the minute we say, wait a minute, let's think about how we want to like distribute resources to our schools. That's the minute it's like, whoa. Just cook my fucking burrito, right? Like, stop. Like, I'll like your food, and I'll like the idea of you, but the minute you want to have like an equal say, like, let's just stop it there.
Yeah, and I would argue too, we didn't start it. Right. They started it first. I think about all the metaphors as well that are used for people of color that are based in food as well. If you read novels or any sort of fish out of water stuff, right? People will talk about, or even like in just everyday conversation, people call Latinas spicy, or they call black people's skin like chocolate, right? Food is part of that othering. It's part of the metaphor where like it's strange, it's different, or the color is a certain way, and that's a great way to talk about people. It's not. It's very objectifying, but it is a part of our culture. We do use food in those ways, and so for us to talk back that's the different thing. Right. The way that I see myself as not introducing politics to food, but more exposing the politics inherent to food. I think that's a very different power dynamic there. How are we doing on time, Simeon?
Yeah, let's open it up. I think we've talked.
Kind of talked about the best way to go about this Q&A might be to have you all talk for a couple minutes with people around you to come up with some questions, and then we'll open it up. How does that sound? Okay, so talk amongst yourselves for a couple minutes, and then we'll field some questions with our speakers.
Yeah, this is good. It gives them a chance to kind of decompress a little bit too. Yeah, good job. Yeah, we vibe really well. Yeah, no, I just. Oh, I know. That's at some point I was like, this is like a podcast.
Well, essentially it will be since you've recorded it.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
If you had a podcast, release it on that.
Yeah. Is it good?
Yeah,
Is it all right? Okay.
Thanks for just like taking the lead and like folding.
No.
It's easy.
Yeah. It's an interesting crowd to kind of figure out.
Yeah.
I know for sure, like that was one of the questions I was gonna ask. Like I know for sure you get that question of like, or just that critique of like, why, like this is such a good thing. Like, why ruin it, right? Like,
Because
why?
I love to see it.
Because it's yeah, and because it's actually not, right? Because it can go in a different direction
Right.
than what you think, where you think it's going.
Right. And I think that like honestly the shock value
Yeah.
is part of the power of it.
Right. Yeah.
To sneak it into food or like to talk about politics in food is still quite subversive.
Right.
It's a shame, but it's also something we can take advantage of.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like almost sacred, right? That like it's supposed to be healing, right?
Yeah,
It's like
It's very
breaking bread,
optimistic,
right?
yeah.
Breaking bread is like supposed to be.
My editor called me out. We had a meeting and she was like, you know, you're probably pessimistic. I was like,
But I mean, I would argue that you're not, right? I would argue that it's incredibly optimistic and that it gets us thinking about a world.
All
that we
right,
want to
so
be,
who
opposed
would
to the
like
world that we
to
have, you know?
start us off with some questions? And I'm gonna give this mic to you so we're recording this event so we can hear you. Questions?
there's one over there on the bench.
On the bench. On the bench,
In the
yes.
dark.
Hey.
Hello. Thank you for taking my question preemptively. So I watch a lot of celebrity chef shows, like the one Padma Lakshmi is on, and I'm super curious as to who she is in real life. But beyond the point, so like on shows like Top Chef, for example, usually in competitions like this, there will be an Asian American contestant, and most of the time they are cooking Asian American cuisine, whatever that means to them. And I've noticed a lot of the time the other contestants will comment on the fact that this person only makes Asian cuisine. And obviously, like, that's very derivative and homogenizing because Asian American cuisine can mean so many different things to so many different people. So I was wondering if either of you guys have encountered this kind of, homogenizing rhetoric in academic spaces, in regular food spaces where you, like, in restaurants where chefs will talk like this too. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah.
Somebody's. Is everybody okay back there?
Yeah, so I certainly get that. I hear it from chefs a lot too. They feel frustrated. Like sometimes they just want to make something different, and they don't want to be pigeonholed because white people can cook anything they want. And so when you are a Japanese American chef, people will ask you if your menu is Japanese American. I've encountered that as well as because I have been a chef at restaurants, and people would sometimes criticize me for putting too many Asian things on the menu when there were maybe 3 out of 30 items. So there's also that perception too, is that like, oh, I could just take over with my like inherent desire for soy sauce on everything, which I found, of course, I didn't end up staying, of course, but that was just another nail in the coffin there. And I also, to the Top Chef point, I find it really interesting that one of the few Asian American chefs who won was Kristen Kish, she doesn't cook Asian food at all, rarely, because she's an adoptee. That's not really her food. She grew up in Michigan with a white family, and that's her culture. And so it's interesting to see like the people who try to impose that on her in her very specific circumstance, because it's actually not authentic to her at all. When she delves into Korean cuisine, it's out of an intellectual desire rather than like something deep or inherent or natural, whatever that means. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with Top Chef. I stopped watching because I found it really like horrifying, but yeah.
I'll make sure to tell Padma you said that. So. I mean, I guess I can answer specifically to like academic spaces because, I feel like one, I'm not a chef, but in terms of the homogenizing, right? I think, and again, we had this conversation in class earlier today. So like, you do get, or at least me, we as scholars of color, and especially those who are working on like Asian American history or Thai American history, you do get pigeonholed and you do get like seen as like your field is just Thai Americans. And for me, I see myself as I'm not just doing Thai American history, I'm exploring the history of LA, of immigration, of empire. I'm doing these broader histories, but I think the perception which has everything to do with race, right? Is that you're doing your group, and like that's all that you do. And so, like this broader history, you will never be able to do because that's left up for the more general historians, the U.S. historians. You do a very niche, specific thing, and I think that's how it kind of manifests. Similarly in the food industry, as you mentioned, but also like in academic spaces. I think that's something that, as scholars of color, if we study our own communities, it's seen as only being relevant to us and only being able to be generalized to that group, right? That like, this is only about Thai people. You can't be, but again, like that's incredibly, and this is what I said earlier, I'm like, it's incredibly racist because the underlying message there is your people are not fully human, so there's absolutely nothing we can learn about them, about the broader world, only about them specifically as a group. And that to me is like the underlying message that I get when this idea of like, oh, it's a nice niche study of a Thai American community in LA. It's such a small niche study. I'm like, how is it niche, right? Who doesn't deal with migration? Who doesn't deal with food and identity formation? Who is not experiencing that? And so I think that's, at least in academic spaces, that's how it's kind of played out.
Thank you again for being here. Such an amazing conversation that's happening tonight. And I have so many questions, and I was just about to ask one that I'd written down, but I'm going to ask one in response to what has just been said. So you just mentioned that it can be pigeonholing if you don't want to be recognized just as like a Thai American historian or Asian American critic. My question is, I guess, do you care about creating those identities at the same time? So like in the same regard of creating distinctly Asian American cuisine, do you find yourself wanting to create distinctly Asian American writing?
Yes. I'm in an awkward position, right? Where like I could have easily taken on a pen name to preserve my anonymity in this role. Because all my pictures are online and they have been online before I had this job, and so if I wanted to be truly anonymous, I could have written as Jane Doe. But I made a choice to not do that because I knew how significant me, in particular, a Vietnamese American queer woman, would be in the role that I have. I'm the only one like me in America. And I knew that my audience and like people who would read my work would take strength in that as well. And so like it was a hard decision to make. And to the question of Asian American writing, or just, writing from a perspective that decenters whiteness, certainly. I actively cultivate that, and I think about that obsessively every time I type anything. And there are ways in which that comes through, where I avoid explanatory clauses, for instance. I try not to over-explain things that, because in my head as a writer, I'm always thinking, who's my audience, right? And for so many mainstream journalists and writers, the audience is a white baby boomer, upper middle class, centrist, whatever, right? So I try to decenter that image and think, okay, what if my readers are Asian American people who are working class, who grew up eating like, at dim sum places, and it was fine, and they can speak Cantonese or whatever. So that is an act that I have to act like all the time, and I can't be complacent because, I grew up here, and so it's very easy to just like recenter that big other in my head if I'm not careful. Another way I do this, though, is comparison is a really easy way to explain food, right? We think about bun xeo, to use a Vietnamese example. A lot of people call it a Vietnamese omelet or a Vietnamese crepe. They use European analogs to get people to understand what they are, which I find, if you dismantle that and you really question it, you're like, why? Why do we need to do this? Because there are other things we can talk about. And it's also not accurate. There's no eggs in bun xeo. Ridiculous. People have very strange ideas of what it is because of the comparison. And so what I do, actually, is compare these dishes to Asian things, which I think is pretty evil. So I compare I compared a squid dish to to steamed tapioca flour, for instance. That kind of shit. It's really subversive.
Yeah, that. It's an excellent question because I think I've shifted a little bit, right? I think initially when I was thinking about this project and thinking about the kind of work that I wanted to do, I was really upset and frustrated that Thai Americans had been invisible in history books, in Asian American history books even. And so I think early on my goal was to say, hey, we're here and we're present and we have a history and a uniquely Thai American story. But then, I think I remembered at some point, right? Like I recalled like the larger commitment that I have to humanity. And that for me goes beyond just my own Thai American identity. And so it's kind of twofold, right? At the same time, I want to highlight and show and represent, I guess, in my way, Thai American history and tell my story of Thai America. But at the same time, like it's not enough. And so this is where I often get miffed sometimes by a lot of work that is purely obsessed just about being represented. Is that, but why? What is that Thai American identity going to do? And for me, being Thai American means I'm connected to all of these other people who have been racialized through food, who have experiences with undocumented immigration, who are struggling with access to healthcare. That then puts me in relation to all of these other groups, which, yes, it's about being Thai American, but it's really about this larger social, political commitment that I have to other groups. And so I think that that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, where even in our field, Asian American Studies, there's lots of scholars who are trying to pave way for their group histories and their own kind of community histories. And I think that has to happen. But if it just ends there, I think that's where some of to me, it's very limiting. If all we're looking for is representation and we're actually not thinking about liberation or working across racial and ethnic lines, like how do we build these these broader relationships? So I think, I try to do both, but I'm really, committed to trying to think about why do I want this Thai American identity and what is it supposed to do beyond just, hey, I'm different, right? I have a different experience than the other Asian Americans, so like we should be talked about too. But like, why? What's the point?
What I found really funny, actually, was when the newspaper announced that I got this job. There was a lot of celebration on social media. People were so excited. I got so many emails. And then once I started writing and saying stuff,
Opening my mouth.
that's when the hate mail came in. And a lot of the same voices were angry because they wanted more of the status quo, but just with a brown face. And so that's a burden that I don't carry lightly. I know that the hate mail is a sign that I'm doing something right. Because if I just wanted to make everyone happy, then that would be completely useless of me.
So, thank you for giving this talk. It was really informative, and I think food is something that's part of the fabric of everybody's lives, and I think it's nice to think of it in a very analytical way. I was actually thinking of something that, Mark, you bring up in your book, both in the first chapter and in your conclusion, I believe, about how whiteness is a means to assert authority over food and a way to push boundaries where, to maybe provide a familiar example is, if you're the Asian American kid at the lunch table who has the smelly lunch, it's weird. However, if you're a white chef who's introducing America to this new cuisine, it becomes palatable. And even if it's the exact same thing, whiteness is a means to justify that. So in both academia and in food writing, how do you kind of negotiate this relationship between kind of like the audience and especially being an Asian American writer, not necessarily having like this whiteness to justify that kind of authority?
This might not be a very helpful answer, but I don't pretend either that, because I think about objectivity a lot as a question of why I do what I do and how I frame things. And I think acknowledging my own subjectivity is the most honest thing I can do, and it, in the end, will result in the most like objective reading of my work, because we all need to just lay out our perspectives on the table in order to just, you know, it's like defining your terms in an academic paper or a research paper. This is what I mean when I say this, and this is where what my background is, and this is the framework that I'm going to apply, you know, as a biochemist to this particular research. I think we can do that with our identity as well. You know, not to the point of like excess, but just saying like this, I know this food from this context, and this is what I'm going to tell you about it. And I think disappearing all of that behind some veneer of expertise is actually the most damaging. People want that. People want a fearless leader. But in the end, I think honesty and vulnerability is actually going to take us further in understanding each other and each other as like cultural products, if that makes sense. Because for so long, yes, I reject the idea of the translator because, yes, I see that as my role in part. Like, I should educate and illuminate, but I don't think explaining things, like I said, like calling things omelets when they're not omelets is not useful for anyone.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm, you know, adequately answering the question, but I think it goes back to kind of what I was saying earlier about when and where I can, making a point that the communities that we study, and as scholars of color, like we are not doing niche work, that we are not doing narrow I mean, obviously they don't call it narrow. They just like, oh, that's an interesting niche, right? Like that's the word. But to any way that I can to kind of highlight that and press people on what they mean by niche and have them say whether or not they think I'm just doing something that I know versus something that is much broader and helps us answer larger questions that everybody is thinking about. And so I think that's one way that I try to do it. You know, and at some level, I guess this is me trying to be as honest as I can too. At some level, I just don't give a shit anymore. Maybe this is the tenure. I don't know. It's just fucking.
It's the tenure.
It's the tenure. It's just kicked in. Like, oh, I don't give a fuck what you think. But there is, at some level, you're just like, I can only do the work that I can do. And then, you know, I think Soleil's point is good too. I try to lay out my position to my topic and my relationship to my topic. But if you're still gonna read it as narrow, I can't help you there, right? Other than to say that you're reading it in a very narrow way.
Where's the hand? Who has a question? Sorry.
Someone at the bar.
Yeah, I thought it was the person in the white hoodie, but maybe the
Hoodie,
question was
white
answered.
hoodie. Oh, okay.
Daniel.
Yeah, you guys touched upon it earlier a little bit about authenticity and like questions around authenticity and like authentic cuisine and stuff. So, I guess my question is like, is authenticity even a real thing? Like, is there, and if so or if not, like, what does it mean when questions around authenticity are posed or criticized for certain cuisines? Because I think about people, even my own communities, where like the authentic taco or like the authentic barbecue, and it's like, it doesn't make any sense to me because certain, like what a particular region, where a taco is being made may be understood as authentic, and it might be different from, a different part of Mexico or somewhere, or Texas, or even in California. And so I guess the question is like, is authenticity even a thing that can be achieved when thinking about cuisine, or is there a better way of thinking about authenticity, or moving away from authenticity and moving into thinking about like, well, is authenticity even an important thing to figure out, if it's even achievable, So.
I've done a lot of wondering about that question as well over the past few years, because I used to also kind of hold Vietnamese restaurants, for instance, to account for departing from my idea of what that cuisine should be. And I realized that my idea of authenticity was very rooted in nostalgia. And when we remember things through a nostalgic lens, we're not really remembering things in the truth of how they are, right? And how they were. They're very much informed by our own sentimentality, our own ideas of like, I experienced this and I'm valid for knowing the true like way that this played out. And that makes me an expert, you know? And so often authenticity can be used as a bludgeon. You hear it in restaurants all the time where, you know, a customer will come in and complain and they'll say like, I had this noodle dish in China and I know for a fact that they don't put X, Y, and Z in this dish, you know, and that is a way to brag, essentially, that you know more. You're the standard bearer because you experienced this thing. But you're not putting into account the fact that people have had to adapt to local ingredients and local grocery store, you know, availability, adapt to local tastes. And the fact that I bet at that restaurant in China the person went to, they probably changed the recipe since that person was there. It ignores the fact that cuisine and culture, people evolve over time. They don't just stay in a box until you are ready to look at the box again. You know what I mean? Like they change over time just like us. There may have been an authentic version of you when you were 5, but you're not that person anymore. And so what I find most helpful when thinking about this question is, if we apply that question to a person, would that be fair? Say it in the mic.
Like, am I an authentic Thai American?
Yes, because I find it like it's an existential question, right?
It is.
Am I an authentic Vietnamese person if I can't speak Viet?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. To also, you know, kind of revisit what I said earlier. I mean, I think I think we can all intellectualize this question of authenticity to the point where it's like nothing is authentic. And I think if we said that, we'd all be correct, right? Nothing is authentic. But where I feel a tension or where it gets complicated for me is when we get into questions about cultural appropriation, because that's when people start to double down on ownership of culture. And in ways, and I say it's complicated for me because they do it in ways that I actually agree with. Right, and so they'll say like, that's not authentic Thai, that's not authentic pad Thai that you're making. But they're saying that because somebody is trying to cook it and like make a profit off of it, or make poke, and they're not even from, you know, the islands or have any relationship to they're just like picking up this trend. And so then people are like, that's not authentic, that's not authentic. And as much as I want to say, well, what is authenticity really? Like, I'm also like, yeah, it's not, right? Like I'm with you, it's not authentic. And because I think there's a power dynamic there. So I think things get really complicated for me there. And, you know, I think, so we can say that nothing is authentic, but then I think it's important to recognize when those debates happen, like what's at stake. And so when you see those debates happening, like, is this or is this not authentic? You can kind of figure out like what's the actual conversation here? Is it about like cultural theft? Is it about erasing people who have been doing this for a long time, but just never getting the recognition? And then the other thing is like, I think about Ali Wong, because she recently did this, I think part of her book, I think she has a new book out, but in it, there's like how to tell if like the Asian restaurant you're eating at is a good one, which is like kind of a play on authenticity, right? So I found it hilarious. And so she has these 2 columns. It's like, is it good? Yes or no? So it's not even that it's authentic, it's just, is it good? But I think she's kind of moving in that direction. It's like a Vietnamese restaurant. If it has like a play on the name pho, it's bad, right? Like avoid that restaurant if it's like fucking good, right? Like no, that's not. If it doesn't accept American Express, that's the one you want to be at, right? And so I think the reason why it's great is because it takes us to think about the social context of what is authentic, right? And less about the food, and less about like, did you handpick that basil yourself, or is that in from the grocery store? It's more about like the cultural construction of what is like good food and what is real. And then like the Filipino food was like, you know, if it's in a restaurant, no. If it's at someone's auntie's house, yes. And that was it, right? It's like if you're eating Filipino food at someone's house, that's the good place to go. If it's anywhere else, it's a no.
I also think that question that you pose, is it authentic or not, is shorthand. There's, like Mark alluded to, there's so many other things running beneath the surface of that question. So I find the more important way to get to the heart of what the point is who's making this and why? And why does it look like this? And then you can start to understand like what's happening in that moment.
So let's take one last question. Hand
Behind the pole.
behind the pole. Right.
So just to complicate the question of authenticity further, and I'm only asking this because as somebody who is a second-generation Chinese American whose mother was from Vietnam, I have no idea I no longer have any idea what is authentic to me in my culture. So I just wanted to ask you, what do you make of second? You guys talked about this a little earlier, and I talked about this with Mark earlier as well, a little more in depth. But as second-generation Asian Americans grow up and open their own restaurants, and they do it in their own sort of way. What does authenticity? What do you guys think authenticity means to them, and how they associate that, or negotiate identity formation, and just like, is it something that's markedly different from first-generation immigrants, or what does it mean really?
All right. So actually, what I find fascinating is contrasting that approach with fusion cuisine as well. Because fusion as a culinary movement really started in like the 80s with like people like Wolfgang Puck, for instance, Jean-Georges von Richten, these like French trained chefs who were essentially bringing in, like folding in like ingredients and techniques from like China and Japan, especially, and melding them with French technique. And, there's a language of elevation that is used pretty persistently in those contexts, right? Like we serve elevated Chinese food or elevated Vietnamese food at this restaurant. And what does that actually mean? And the power dynamic is pretty inherent in the word, right? Like if you elevate something, that means it's here and you're bringing it up by association with you. And so I find that really fascinating. That's fusion. For what you're explaining or talking about with like second generation chefs and restaurateurs and just creatives in general, what you see is a different frame of reference. With fusion, it is someone from like a Eurocentric point of view grabbing like what they want and putting it within their own frame of reference. The other example is people who are looking out into mainstream culture, into majority culture, and putting it within their frame of reference. And so I think the power dynamics are switched here. If, for instance, let me think. So I wrote this piece about assimilation cuisine, which is kind of the name I gave to the latter example. I interviewed chefs. Among them, there was a person who was South Asian by way of Tanzania and came to the US. And his family, it was Eritrea. And his family made bolognese sauce and but it was like with chickpeas and like berry spice. And then they made it into like tacos when they eventually moved to LA. And so to me, that's not fusion. Actually, that's them looking out into the context in which they were migrants and trying to adapt to local, like just the food that they were able to get. And so like the children of those families grow up with all of this cultural mishmash. And I think that menus are so fascinating for seeing how this plays out psychologically too. Because they're working stuff out, in the moment, and they're trying to figure out, okay, like this, it doesn't mean. Like, I grew up eating, like, Wonder Bread with soy sauce on it, and I thought that was the same thing as rice. Because it was, you didn't have to make rice. It was easy. And I didn't see that as less legitimate. It's just what we had because we were fucking poor, And it's still something that I'm really fond of, and it still, to me, is part of a Vietnamese American, like, paradigm of growing up in this particular way. So I think you get, and this is where we start talking about third culture, you get a really compromise-ridden way of seeing the pantry as a family or as a culture gets more and more embedded within like a new culture. And I think the question of authenticity kind of falls flat in that case, because it goes back to the earlier point I made of like how people evolve, people change, they acclimate, and that doesn't mean they're losing anything. I think that's a really problematic framing. I think they gain a lot too of their own way of seeing things and feeling things and just framing things. And I think when we pull it back to the idea of framing, I think that's the most helpful. Because when my grandma goes to the grocery store, she sees all these things she can put in her own like dishes, you know, not things that she has to conform herself to.
Yeah, I don't know if, I have more questions than I have answers for this. Hopefully good questions. I think one of the questions I have is, I wonder if authenticity, cultural authenticity of one's food carries the same kind of capital that it did, say, in the 60s or 70s, right? So the period that I study, it was really important for Thai restaurateurs to say that they were serving authentic Thai food because it was a moment where there was increased immigration to LA. Multiculturalism was not yet an idea, right? It was just a forming idea. And so because it's forming, people want to like really make their cultures salient and visible and recognizable, and so they're gonna be really invested in authenticity, right? This is authentic. For second generation Asian American restaurateurs, I don't know how much, that's the question, right? I don't know how much cultural authenticity of food, how much that will do for them. And I say that because, maybe the food scene or the food landscape has shifted so that people are not necessarily looking for the most authentic, but maybe they're looking for the most kind of cutting edge or the best spin of an authentic. And so for me, it's about like what is the current moment and what value does claiming cultural authenticity have. And I know I mentioned this too, a lot of second generation Thai chefs are simply saying, I don't know if this is authentic, and openly saying, I don't know if this is authentic to Thailand, but this is what I learned cooking from my parents, from my grandmother, so it's authentic to me. And they're kind of moving on past that conversation of what is or isn't authentic and just saying, it's authentic to me. I'm just gonna cook the food that I like to eat and that I like to cook, and that's authentic because it's mine and it's from LA and this is who I am altogether. And so I feel like that holds a lot of capital now too, of like more local, LA, regional. I'm an LA Thai chef. This is my perspective. So yeah, I would think about what value cultural authenticity has in different moments.
All right, I think that's a good place to end. Please help me thank our guests.
Thank you all.
All right, so we have books for sale in the back, and we also have mango rice. Each person, just take one. I'm not sure we have enough for everybody, so don't be greedy. Thank you.